if we, the bunch of us, managed to make China so uncomfortable that they attack Australia, would the American people come rushing to Australia's aid? And David, what do you think in that case?
I can't speak for the U.S. public, which will answer polls dramatically opposite answers depending on exactly how it's worded. But I think the U.S. government and certain madmen within the U.S. government and the U.S. weapons industry and the profit motive that I think drives this whole thing even more than the electoral concerns of Australian politicians would push to make a devastating attack on Australia a devastating attack on the entire globe. It would be a reason for war on China, I'm afraid. I don't want to have to, get to that point and find out who's right and who's wrong. I don't want Australia to be bombed, but I'm afraid chances are more than even that a Chinese attack on Australia, without this being a concern or even a decision that's already been made, just the momentum, because there would be U.S. troops in Australia who would die. There would be U.S. weapons that would be destroyed. I would love for this calculation of a politician to backfire and for that to be the lesson that's taught, that when you make yourself a vassal state to U.S. empire and you buy U.S. weapons, which means U.S. personnel servicing those weapons, the U.S. military overseeing your military, you're not making yourself a big macho man. You're making yourself a servant to an empire that does you not a darn bit of good. And when we look at the war in Afghanistan, you got the United States doing what it wants, stupidly, illegally, devastating consequences, and absolutely no accountability. Who's left out of the investigation at the International Criminal Court? The United States. But it's junior partners. It's ridiculously junior partners. It's token number of troop junior partners there exclusively to make it somehow legitimate by making it a bigger criminal gang engaged in the operation. They've generated terrorist attacks and threats back home in their own countries in exact proportion to how many troops they sent to participate in Australia. So what lesson is to be learned, right? There are countries like Australia and the United Kingdom, both of them in this new, USUCA alliance that have some, remnants of respect for the rule of law, that may hold some people accountable within their own militaries, whereas the United States doesn't, right? So you're getting into a war for somebody who's going to kick you around, use you as a pseudo legalization, legitimation of the war, allow you to be held accountable even by international bodies, whereas they won't. And is putting troops in your country and weapons and the people to oversee the weapons in your country for its own interests. They have nothing to do with your interests, or China is your biggest trading partner. And you're going to start a war on China to protect your trade routes with China. It's madness. And you have a report out this week from the Congressional Research Office with 3 different ways that the U.S. military could cut $1 trillion and be just fine by its own standards, its own stated goals. And you have Congress increasing military spending while supposedly ending the wars. This is not the exclusive, single explanation of everything, but this is a major motivating factor here. There are a small number of people getting stinking rich at the expense of the rest of us. And the politicians they're major players, but they're not the core of the problem.
Alison, are there people in Australia getting rich too?
Not many. Well, some are, but not from this sort of stuff. We are the buyers of all the awful stuff that David just described. Mm-hmm. And that's why when our Prime Minister, Morrison, met together with your president Joe Biden and with Boris Johnson at the G8 meeting. That's why they had a little meeting of their own, the three of them, which Johnson gate crashed. It was supposed to be one-on-one between the president and Morrison. Johnson gate crashed that because they were having a party, because Australia had signed up to pay all the costs of the party, buy all the drinks and caviar, and they were delighted. And that was it. They signed and sealed it at that meeting. And Morrison came home and announced it. No wonder they were laughing. They are the ones who are making all the money. It's British and American weaponry, technology, and every other possible thing. Servicing, fuel, the lot. We don't have a uranium industry in Australia. We dig uranium out of the ground and sell it, but we don't refine it at all. And one suspicion I have, over and above the earlier one that I mentioned to you about our next election, the other suspicion I have is that part of the purpose in Australia of certain people who are rich, as you say, and perhaps are seeking to enrich themselves even further, are the uranium industry people who have been pushing for a long time for nuclear power in Australia, a nuclear industry in Australia, claiming that this would do the job for climate change. Well, it wouldn't, because we have to have 50 nuclear power plants all around the coast of the country where nobody would want them. Secondly, they would cost an arm and a leg. And thirdly, they wouldn't be built in time to make any significant impact on climate change at all. So we're better off without them and without the huge debt that we would incur in building them. But these guys would not incur the debt. These are the guys who would become filthy rich, as you say. And that, I do suspect, is one of the push factors behind Morrison's decision to announce this thing.
Okay. There's two things. First of all, I was reading an article where they mentioned just what you were mentioning about a nuclear industry there. And one of the authors actually led to the idea, well, it could establish a nuclear industry, but it could also lead to Australia enriching enough uranium to actually end up making nuclear weapons. Would you see that happening at all?
Well, that would be exactly the consequence. And I'm sure that the people who want this to happen have that in mind. And that's one of the reasons why this nuclear element of the submarines has been introduced. 5 or 6 years ago, when they originally made the agreement with France, France was offering to build nuclear submarines, which they have, build them with using low enriched uranium rather than high, build those in Australia. And Australia at that time said, well, we'd like your submarines, but sorry, we can't do the nuclear bit. So we want you to retrofit them to have ordinary diesel engines. That is one of the reasons why it's taken such a long time and why this project has been so expensive and so unproductive. And the French are correct in being very annoyed because they offered a nuclear submarine in the first place, and we turned it down. I mean, we couldn't have shot ourselves in both feet better than what we have done. And that's what we've got. We can't walk.
And Alison, this is the big opposition that we hear about in the U.S. media to this mad warmongering idea is the opposition from the French, who want to sell more French mad war weapons, right? There's no voice of sanity. There's no opposition to the nuclear subs. There's no questioning of the sub that they just crashed into. They won't say what in the South China Sea, that they won't even call the South China Sea. And we were never asked. The U.S. public was never asked about any of this. Hardly been told about
any of it. And we were not asked. It was a complete surprise to us, complete surprise to the French. And you can understand why they're annoyed about that. And the Germans, who were supplying some components of all this. I mean, if we had set out, if our prime minister had set out to make enemies out of all our friends and worse enemies out of our enemies, he couldn't have done it better. But I just wanted to say there is one exception to all this stupidity, and it's always the same. New Zealand is always on the side of the angels, and they're always critical of us.